my name is Holly, so I'll be running today's session. So Janine will traditionally run most of the sessions, but I happen to do quite a few critical appraisals. So this is sort of an area that is my specialty. So today we're going to be talking about critically appraising a study. So for the most part, critical appraisal is looking at the quality of the evidence. So we can find that evidence comes in different hierarchies. So we will say this evidence is the best kind of evidence that you can have, and then we'll have evidence that is good quality, and they mean different things. So critical appraisal is the process of examining the research evidence to assess its validity and the relevance to informing a decision. So as you guys are clinicians, when you are assessing an article, we're not looking at, well, was this a well-written article? What we're looking at is, what is the article saying, and how much of that can you apply to your clinical practice? And what that means is we need to know the elements of that article that are done well and the elements of the article that are done poorly, not so that we can judge the article, but so that we can understand how much of that you can then take and put into your practice. So the way that we assess these articles is through critical appraisal checklists. So these checklists, there are many, many of them, are designed to kind of give you a ballpark score so that you can kind of understand whether or not the article that you're looking at is of high methodological quality or whether it's of average or low methodological quality. Now, I will say this slide here says that are designed to give you an overall score. So most checklists won't come out at the end with a number saying this score is 8 out of 10, for example, and that means that it is high quality. Some do. So for example, the Pedro does have a scoring system, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different types in a moment. But for the most part, there isn't a specific rating system, and there's a bit of a clinical judgment that goes into whether or not you decide that article is going to be of high quality or of low quality. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of weighting different article questions, different questions in a critical appraisal as a clinician, and understanding when you're looking at a critical appraisal tool and deciding which tool to use as clinicians, you need to be thinking about what's looking for my needs. So even though most checklists we're looking to kind of provide a score almost, not every checklist will automatically say, add this up and this is our set benchmark. You'll need to make that decision yourself. So there are over 120 published critical appraisal instruments. So there are heaps of them, to put it nicely. A lot of them are going to be based towards experimental studies like randomized control trials. You'll find that there are quite a few as well for systematic reviews, to critically appraise systematic reviews. And then studies which would traditionally be lower on the hierarchy scale, so the NHMRC hierarchy of evidence, they tend to have fewer tools associated with assessing them as well. So that's not necessarily right, but that's just the reality of what's kind of happening in the critical appraisal world. So here at ICAR, we have put together a list. So we've got here on this page a list of useful critical appraisal tools. So these are the most commonly used critical appraisal tools, and you might be familiar with some of them on this page. So as I mentioned before, the Pedro, which is an experimental studies tool, so that only is used to assess RCTs. And then you can see on there the CASP, that's a fairly common critical appraisal tool, and there are many of them. The CASP has tools that can be used for observational studies, experimental studies, systematic reviews. They're quite diverse. And then there are going to be some lesser known tools on there as well. So this is the list of critical appraisal tools that are available on this slide. However, you can access, we have quite a comprehensive list on our website. So if you go to the International Centre for Allied Health Evidence website, you'll see that there is a link for resources, and then under that resources link, there is a link for critical appraisal tools. So in the critical appraisal tools link, what you'll be needing to do is you just click on that and it'll take you through. We have a really comprehensive list of critical appraisal tools, and they have been sorted into the different study designs. So if you are looking for a critical appraisal tool because you have a specific article that you want to assess, you can go on there, look for the study design that you are assessing, and then pick a critical appraisal tool that you think will be most appropriate. We are in the process of updating that page. It's our most popular page on our website, so we're just in the process of making sure that we've got all of the critical appraisal tools, or at the very least links to other libraries that also have compendiumed together a list of critical appraisal tools. But you can access that anytime, and it's quite a comprehensive list of tools for you to be able to move forward onto the next stage. So critical appraisals, we're looking at 3 broad questions, and most of them are around the results. So what we're looking at is, are the results valid? What are they? And can they be applied to your clinical practice? So as clinicians, that's one of the kind of key points that you want to be unpacking. The results of the article can be really valid and really important, but if you can't then take that and put that in your clinical practice, then it feels a little bit moot point to have done the earlier stages. So some of the ways that we are looking at assessing for that is to be looking at the external validity. So this is looking at how relevant it is to your practice. Now, different critical appraisal tools will have different questions relating to this sort of area. So some tools are really specific. They will be saying questions just like this, which is how generalizable is it to your practice? Who was studied? What was the population that was looked at? And then it makes it a little bit easier for you to then think about your practice and your context and see whether or not what's been done in that study can be then applied to your practice. Some tools aren't quite as specific as this. They might not ask these questions, but if you are thinking in your mind for the reason why you're assessing that article, it will help you pick an appropriate tool, but it will also help you know whether or not you need to perhaps modify that tool for your specific purposes. So what we're looking at when we're looking at the external validity is how much you can take and then apply. So the big question there is not just, well, I work with aged care, so I'm looking for people over the age of 65. You'd also want to be considering the other elements of your practice, the other contexts of your practice. So, for example, you'd want to think about if the study is looking at using a new type of treatment, which might have new equipment involved, you then have to think about whether or not practically your practice could then implement that by purchasing the equipment, training the staff to then be able to perform that therapy, and whether or not then patients will be able to afford to access that treatment as well. So there's a couple of different layers, and the critical appraisal checklist that you use may or may not ask questions about this. So it's important to think about the different types of tools. So if we're moving on, the next stage that we're looking at is internal validity. So these internal validity points that we're looking at are more relevant to the quantitative studies. What we're looking at here is more quantitative RCTs and cohort studies, most likely. So what we're looking at is now how well was the study done. So before, what we're looking at is not how well was the study done, but how much can you apply it to your practice. Whereas when we're looking at internal validity, then we're assessing the quality of the research itself. So these are the questions about well, was there enough people for you to be confident that the effect that was found or the outcome that was found was true to what they were aiming for? Do you believe that the inclusion and exclusion criteria was accurate? And that's where you may start looking at your clinical practice as well. So if you're looking at a study that's based in a different country, they may have different diagnostic criteria depending on what field you're in or what condition you're looking at. So you might then need to assess the inclusion and exclusion criteria according to your context as well. But it also gives you a good idea of internally whether or not they have been accurate with their diagnostic criteria. And so then you'll also be looking at things sort of like, well, what was the response rate? Were there lots of dropouts? If there's an RCT, then you might need to consider, was there more people dropping out in one group than the other? And that can be an indicator of potentially something internally going a little bit awry. And then also you have to think about, with your knowledge of the subject, was the follow-up rate long enough? So this is particularly important with cohort studies, which have a tendency to follow people over long periods of time. When you're looking at internal validity, what you specifically want to be looking at is the threats to internal validity. So these are the things that can potentially weaken a study. So it gives you an opportunity to be looking at the research and assessing it to decide whether or not you think there was opportunities for the people who were conducting the study to have taken more care or potentially made changes to the study to make it stronger evidence. So some examples of the bias are things like selection or sampling bias, so that might be how they recruited their participants. Allocation bias is whether or not they randomized their participants in a truly random fashion or whether they were sort of flipping a coin. That's not quite the right way to be randomizing. And then you might also be looking at measurement bias or placebo bias, all of those sorts of things. Anything that could potentially allow someone to say, I'm not sure that the outcome that you found was because of the thing that you were looking at. So the intervention, for example. So a lot of the time with biases, the best way to control most of them is to have a control group, but that's not a foolproof way to do it. So if you're reading a study and you see control group, that doesn't mean that all of those biases are going to be controlled for. You then need to be looking at, well, if there is a control group or more than one intervention group, how were people sorted into those groups? And did people know that they were in different groups? Those are all things that can affect the outcome. So we won't go into too much detail into the different types of bias, but that's just a short snippet of that. So in terms of that, all of that, which we were just talking about, was more about quantitative studies. So with qualitative studies, we start to get into a little bit of a different beast. So with most clinical practice data or any studies that clinicians are mostly interested in, they tend to lean more towards the quantitative side of things. And that is mostly because what we're looking at is an intervention or something along those lines that we are looking to see whether or not it is effective. And studies of effectiveness generally are going to be using quantitative data. Qualitative data is more about the how than it is about the, more about the why, sorry, than it is about the how. So what we're looking at there is a different, we're looking at something quite different. So in terms of, as clinicians, you might not necessarily access qualitative-based studies as often, depending on your field. So when you are accessing these qualitative studies, it's important to remember that they're going to have different types of bias that could be imposed on them, and they're going to need different things to ensure that they are rigorous. So, for example, with a quantitative study, you can have an increased amount of rigor by having using a validated and reliable outcome measure. Whereas with a qualitative study, if you are, say, conducting an interview, you're not using an outcome measure. But what you can do is you can then give that interview, say, back to the original participant and have them check to make sure that it is consistent. And that gives you an opportunity to say, yes, this transcript that I have of the interview is accurate. So it's not quite the same as having something that's validated beforehand, but it does give you an opportunity to increase the rigor of your study. So when you're reading about qualitative research, you need to take into consideration that there are going to be different things that can influence the research. We know in quantitative research, that researcher bias can be an issue. So if a researcher knows which group a participant has been sorted into, they could inadvertently give preference to one group over the other. With qualitative research, you're less likely to have a randomization. And if you do, we need to consider the fact that it's a lot more interactory. Sorry, that's not quite the right word, but it tends to be based more in interviews or focus groups, which means that the researcher themselves tends to interact a lot more with the participant. So there's a bit more opportunity there for potential bias. So you need to be thinking about the researcher and what their role in the research is, whether or not they're going to have a previous relationship with some of the participants, and whether or not that could have an influence. Now, as clinicians, what that means is that potentially you might be reading a study that's based in a hospital, and you might notice that one of the authors is from that hospital, and they might be, say, interviewing staff. That's something there that you might consider if they haven't said anything in the paper about addressing that issue, that you might think about when you're reading, well, I can see here that this is a senior staff member at the hospital interviewing other staff members at the hospital, and it might raise a few questions or red flags for you in terms of qualitative research. So there are a couple of different ways that you can increase the rigor. So one of them, as I was saying before, is you can get participants to review their transcripts. But there are other ways, such as if you're doing an observational study. So for example, if you were assessing hand hygiene compliance and you needed observers, you could have more than one independent observer who's doing the recording so that there's a little bit less bias there. You could also use triangulation. So what that means is you try and get your data from more than one source and then triangulate it all together so you can then look at whether or not there's consistency across the different data sources, which with qualitative research, you're aiming to have that consistency. So qualitative research is a bit of a different beast to quantitative research, but they both serve their purposes. So when you are doing your critical appraisals, what you'll find is there are some really common critical appraisal tools and really common critical appraisal questions that crop up, especially for the most common study designs. So the most common ones that you'll see are for systematic reviews, randomized control trials, and cohort studies. Most of the time with cohort, it doesn't matter if it's a prospective cohort study, so a cohort study that followed people through time, or if it was retrospective, meaning that it's looking at old or retrospective data. So what we're going to do is we'll go through a couple of different examples of critical appraisals for these most common types of studies that we'll be looking at. So the first one is systematic review. So thinking back to before when we were talking about the key questions that we ask when we're looking at critical appraisal, we've got, are the results valid? What are the results? And will the results help locally? So over here, we can see some examples from a critical appraisal tool. So this critical appraisal tool that we're looking at here is called the CASP. So this is, as I was saying, one of the most common tools. And you can see that what they're looking at here links back in quite strongly to these original 3 points. So did the review address a clearly focused question? So that will tell you about what have they used a PICO before they've gone in and looked at their search. So can you clearly identify who the population was? Can you clearly identify what intervention they're looking at? And can you clearly identify whether or not there was a comparator that they were trying to examine? And also, what were the outcomes that they were looking to get? So this links back into, are the results valid? So because you're looking at this and can say, well, yes, I can see really clearly what they were trying to achieve. That just makes, when you get to the results, makes you think a bit more that they've thought this through. These results are most likely going to be genuine. So I won't go into too much detail about the other ones, other questions, but you can kind of tell each one is linking back in and giving you more information about whether or not the results of the review are valid, and then coming down to this last one, which is, will the results help locally? Most critical appraisal tools aren't going to ask specific questions about your local context. The CASP tool does ask things like, do you believe the results? Can it be applied to a local population? Do you think the benefits are worth the harms and costs? But not every critical appraisal tool you come across will ask that. And that's why it's important for you to be thinking, well, why am I reading this study? What's the purpose of my appraisal? And then picking your tool based around your purpose. So in a similar vein, this is again the CASP tool, and then this is the randomized controlled trials. So the difference between the randomized controlled trial and the systematic review is that we're looking at asking slightly different questions. So with a randomized controlled trial, what's important to the quality of the study is going to be different from a systematic review. So with a randomized controlled trial, we want to know, well, if people were put into different groups, did they know or were they blinded? Whereas with a systematic review, we're going to be more interested in things like, do you think they covered all of the appropriate studies? Do you think that they've done a very thorough search? And so again, we can see here that the results, what we're looking at is, are the results valid? What are they? And then do they help in a local context? Now, the CASP is one of those tools which doesn't have a set score at the end. When you're scoring the CASP, you get the option to say yes, can't tell, or no. But you don't get a digit at the end, like 8 out of 10 to provide to say, yes, I think this is high quality, or no, I don't think this is high quality. We'll talk about that again in a moment. So this is a qualitative tool. So this one is for using the CASP as well. And so this just gives you an idea of the types of questions that we're asking about with a qualitative critical appraisal. So we can see immediately that the critical appraisal tool for qualitative is very different from the critical appraisal tool for a quantitative, because we're asking more about whether or not you think they've made the right choice to use this methodology, and whether or not you think it's been developed well, because with qualitative research, that's what's important. When you're developing interview questions, for example, that's just as important as conducting the interview. Whereas with a quantitative study, you might find that there's an outcome measure that everyone uses that's excellent, it's been well validated, it's gold standard. So the choice of making, the choice that you're making to use that measure is not as important as, say, developing the interview questions in a qualitative study. So when you are assessing the quality, you're going to be looking at that sort of thing as well. And so it also helps you link back to the bias that we were talking about before. So when you're looking at assessing a study, what you're really assessing is the bias. So we're just going to have a run through of an example of a critical appraisal. So now this is an example that we chose for 2 reasons. So here at ICAR, we run journal clubs. So we service quite a few clinicians across South Australia to assist them with providing critical appraisals for their journal clubs. Now, the reason we picked this particular study to show you, you guys, is the fact that this is a critical appraisal that's based in the CASP tool, but it has been modified for the specific purposes of an ICAR journal club. And we picked this to give you an example of how we would critically appraise here at ICAR, but also to show you that if you have specific needs as clinicians, sometimes you'll find the appraisal tools that you're looking at won't necessarily strictly meet those needs. So if you are looking at an intervention because you are planning on implementing it in your practice, it's already been decided and you're just gathering some more evidence, the questions that you'll be asking are going to be slightly different from a group who is only just starting to decide what they want to do. So you might decide, as you're coming through, you might pick, say, the Pedro tool, for example, and then as you're doing your assessments, find that even though it meets all your criteria, it doesn't ask enough about the methods. And you might add a question or two to flesh that out because that's the specific needs that you have. So this critical appraisal tool here is for a systematic review. The study is just up here, so it's looking at, sorry, I'm going to say that middle word wrong, but treatment effects for dysphagia in Parkinson's disease, a systematic review. I'm sorry if I said that very wrong, if any of you are speech pathologists, but just moving down. So when you perform a critical appraisal, it's not a necessity for you then to provide evidence for whether or not you have selected yes, can't tell, or no. When we do a journal club, we always provide that evidence because that's part of our service in doing a journal club. But you as clinicians might find that if it's for your personal use, there's no need to make sure that you outline, well, what is the aim here if you are saying yes, or what is the clearly focused question. You can just say, yes, there is one, and move on. What you might find is you may want to do it for practice when you start, or if you're working in a large group. This just means that later on down the track, when you might be comparing with colleagues this critical appraisal for the same article, you give yourself a justification for why you've made certain decisions. But for the most part, if you've got, say, 50 articles that you have to appraise because you are working with your team to do a review, you might find that it is more prudent for you just to say yes, can't tell, or no. When it comes to most critical appraisals, the yes, can't tell, or no, or whatever system is being used for that critical appraisal tool is something that you will set as a team. So the CASP tool comes with hints. It'll say, does this look for the appropriate sort of papers? And then it'll say, hint, tell us a little bit about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Do you think that that's appropriate for what they're looking at? But you as your team might sit down and set a specific rule to meet a yes. So you might say, for them to have looked at appropriate sorts of papers, they must have included studies from more than one language. And that means that when you then go forth and do your critical appraisals, any article that doesn't have that criteria, you'll say no. But that's something that you decide based on the needs of your specific clinical context. So scrolling down on this particular appraisal, up the top the questions match almost perfectly to the CASP questions. So the top half of this critical appraisal here, we won't go into the details, but the top half of this critical appraisal here is designed to be exactly the same as the CASP. But as we get a bit further down, what we're looking at here is about clinical context. So these questions are still linked in quite strongly with the CASP tool, but we don't answer them for you because that's something that you as a clinical team need to be looking at. We've also added into ours some specific notes for context assessments. So these are things to help you understand, well, what are you looking for when you do a context assessment? Because it's so much more than just, oh, well, my patients are the same. We need to also be looking at, well, is it within the same healthcare system? Because even between first world countries, the healthcare system is going to be dramatically different. Are there barriers to you being able to put this into practice should you choose? Is it financial? Is it management? Is it staffing? There are all sorts of things that need to be considered. And so these questions here are going to be the most important ones for you as clinicians. So when you get back into the CASP tool, the questions themselves don't change, but the hints and things that you might be providing to your groups or to yourself, if you're doing critical appraisal just for your own benefit, are going to be different. And when you jump into different types of critical appraisals, you'll find that the information that they provide is going to be very different. So I would recommend, just as an exercise, that you look at the difference between the CASP tool and the SIGN tool. So the Scottish Intercollegiate, I'm not sure what the G stands for actually, Guidelines Network, actually, the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network. They have a set of critical appraisal tools and then the CASP critical appraisal tools. Both of them are available on the ICAR website. We've got links to them. When you jump into each of those tools, you can look at the list of instructions that are provided by those tools to help guide you with your appraisals. And you can see the difference in the amount of detail provided so that you can kind of get an idea of that each critical appraisal tool that you look at is going to have slightly different guidance to how you answer a question, even if the question is exactly the same. And that just can help you understand that in your teams, you don't need to follow these really strict rules about, oh, well, they said it has to be 2 databases only. You might find that if you're looking at a specific piece of evidence that it matches perfectly with your field and you still want to be assessing it properly, or you know within your field it's not possible to look at certain things, but the critical appraisal tool is going to mark it poorly, and you might make adjustments to suit that. What is important about that, though, is that it's consistent. So jumping between studies, if you are randomly changing your rules between studies, but you're assigning them scores, you'll find at the end you might end up with 5 high quality studies that if anyone else looked at them, they would be more than one different kind of quality. So as long as we're keeping to the same standards across what you're looking at, it's okay for you to be making these tweaks and changes for you to address your specific clinical practice. It changes a little if you're planning on publishing something, for example, if it's you're writing a review. That's where things get a little bit different. You might need to stick within the guidelines provided a bit more strictly. But if you are doing critical appraisals for your clinical practice, which I think most of you will, that's the context you'll be doing them within, then you need to be thinking about, firstly, what do you need? Why are you reading? Okay, which appraisal fits that best? Is there anything I need to be thinking about before I get started, which will help me get the most out of this article? And then if yes, you can make the appropriate tweaks and changes consistently across the different critical appraisal tools you might be using. So that's probably the best explanation. So the other thing to be thinking about when you're looking at a critical appraisal is making sense of the results that you get. So making sense of the results in the study is something that we're going to be talking about more in the next section of the research methods development group. So if that's something you're interested in, so for example, unpacking the results because you don't necessarily know what an odds ratio is for, there we have a separate class looking at that. What I'm talking about here with making sense of the appraisal results is understanding that some studies that you might be reading may report as low quality. So typically a systematic review might report as low quality, but it might be because the evidence that they're assessing is only low quality. So for example, in the CASP, there are some questions about meta-analysis, but you might find that a study can't do a meta-analysis because the data that they have access to is just not adequate for it. And they'll still be marked down for not having done that, when really as researchers, they've made the right decision. So that's where you might need to use your clinical judgment about whether or not you think the quality of the study is affected by that decision. The other thing to be thinking about is you might have a systematic review that's been done fantastically. It ticks all the boxes, it's all yeses. But then when you get to the end, you go, I'm just not sure if I believe the results. And that might be because even though the systematic review has done everything perfectly, the evidence base that it is using is of low quality. And so even though the evidence base that they are reporting on is reporting, say, a positive outcome, those studies that they are reporting might be poor enough for you to then question whether or not that's a true positive outcome. A good systematic review, however, will point that out. They will say, oh, we were looking at low quality studies because that's all that was available, so this should be taken with a grain of salt, essentially. So the next question is, what if the paper doesn't answer your specific question? So for example, if you had a question about prevalence and you're trying to find a study that will answer that question, you're not going to find the answer to that question in a systematic review, because most systematic reviews aren't going to assess prevalence of an issue unless that's their specific focus. So what you want to be looking at is making sure that the study that you have picked to be assessing is appropriate for the kind of question that you're asking. But then on the flip side of that, the study that you're looking at might be very specific to your specific question, but then when you get to the end, you're kind of left with more questions than answers. And so what that means is there's two things you can do there. The first thing is you pick up and you go and you find some more evidence and you see if you can flesh out the argument that has been made, or see if you can seek the answer to the question. The other thing that you might be looking at is that the paper that you might be reading might be the most up-to-date piece of evidence in your field, and you might find that there just isn't any evidence that answers your question. And that might put you in a good opportunity to perhaps be the person who looks at that piece of evidence and decides, actually, there's no evidence about this, I'm going to find it myself, which is a daunting task to consider. So there are a couple of things to be thinking about if the paper doesn't answer your question. The first is your question appropriate? The second is, well, maybe this piece of evidence isn't enough. Maybe I need to keep looking to be able to answer my question. And then the third is, well, perhaps there just isn't any evidence which answers my question. And it's important to consider all three before you make any quick or rash decisions about how you'll move ahead, because you might look at a piece of evidence and think, oh, there's no evidence in this area, I'm going to do it myself. But it would really be unfortunate if you thought that and started and then went and did a bit more research and found actually there's another paper which does more specifically answer your question. So those are the different things as to what you can do if you're finding that a paper that you're reading doesn't specifically answer your question. Okay, so that's basically what we do with a critical appraisal and how critical appraisal works and why we look at doing critical appraisal. So this is a fairly stock standard explanation. So there might have been bits and pieces that you guys have heard before or that you recognize or remember, and there might be bits and pieces that were new to you. But back onto the JBI critical appraisal tools. I haven't personally used them, but most of the time we find that the funders are either asking for a specific tool or that if they haven't asked for a specific tool, those are the tools that are the most well regarded. So we have a tendency to lean more towards using the CASP tools and use the JBI tools, and not the JBI tools, the sign tools. So I haven't personally used the JBI ones very often. I know they are really easy to use. So I think it just depends on your personal preference. As I was saying, you can kind of mix and match tools as needed. So if you personally are going, oh, actually, I quite like these tools, they're what's easiest for me to understand, I think that they're probably going to be the ones for you to go with. There isn't necessarily a ranking of critical appraisal tools that says this tool is better than the other. So it really just comes down to what you prefer. Yes, it can be hard, especially since if you're doing multiple critical appraisals, if you're working with tools that perhaps you feel are more difficult, it can be a bit hard to make that decision like, oh yes, I have to be stuck in this tool forever. So I think it's best to just go with your personal preferences. You might decide later on that you want to change tools to something that adds a bit more to why you're asking the questions that you're asking, but again, that comes straight down to personal preference. So yeah, be reassured that you're not making the wrong decision if you choose a different tool. It's completely up to you. So thank you everyone for your engaging questions and for listening and joining in, and I'll say goodbye.